You've probably heard of the Garden of Eden, but have you ever heard of the ancient mysterious place called the Shimi? According to Sumerian sources, this was Enki's hidden laboratory complex near Eridu, where the first humans, Adamu and Tamamat, were fashioned as proof of concept for mass-produced workers. The tablets hint at sterile halls, controlled experiments, and a moment when everything shifted, when these creations gained self-awareness and reproductive power. Enlil's reaction wasn't reverence, it was alarm. They had built something they could no longer fully control. And how do we even know this story? Because somewhere in ancient Uruk, a reed stylus pressed into wet clay, recording names and events. Among those impressions is a word that still echoes 5,000 years later: Anunnaki. Imagine that instant, the stylus flick, the pause of the scribe, as a name took shape that carried mystery and authority, hardened in sun-baked clay and preserved across millennia. For the people who first read it, these syllables did not point to vague gods who roamed free. Their meaning was exact. The Anunnaki were the offspring of An, the children of the great Sky Father. In a world where ancestry commanded the shape of social life, being named as children of An was no poetic flourish. It meant cosmic legitimacy, as if your family line stretched beyond cities and rivers into the still points of the stars. To invoke that word was to call on beings whose very identity was grounded in genealogy at the highest scale possible. And yet, while other Mesopotamian gods carried clear titles, God of Storms, Lord of Waters, Bringer of Grain, the Anunnaki were never so easy to pin down. They show up in surviving lines not as divine farmers or warriors, but as a council without a singular task, a body that deliberates, not managers of rain or war, but arbiters of balance, adjusting the scales of fate themselves. They appear not in the rush of battle or harvest, but in assemblies deciding what destiny should mean for gods and people alike. Picture a temple in Uruk under a sky thick with stars. The painted bricks look pale and cold under starlight. On the terraces, priests raise their eyes to constellations carrying divine names. Above those bricks and shadows hangs the awareness of the Anunnaki as arbiters, rooted not in one storm or flood, but in the ongoing structure of the cosmos. Their authority mirrors the stillness of the constellations, unchanging, stable markers in a shifting sky. In that society, lineage meant security. Your father's name, your clan, your descent, all dictated what you were allowed to be. To declare that the Anunnaki were the children of An was to tie them to an order that nothing could unseat. Stars are born, but once set, their paths endure through ages. Calling these beings the Sky Father's offspring lent them that same quality of permanence. They embodied the sense of structure inside a world that often seemed fragile. This is why they were not imagined as colourful characters with outsized tempers. Instead, the records show them in formation as assemblies. Ancient texts speak of them convened as deliberate groups issuing formal rulings on matters of fate. They were less like quarrelling gods from later myths, and more like a silent senate. The myths give us glimpses of their council chambers. One could imagine a chamber of skystone, hierarchies arranged, and presiding above the rest, and a process mirrored in earthly gatherings of elders who governed human affairs. Archeology grounds this in reality. Their name is written into the earlier surviving clay tablets dating near 3000 BCE. That means when you whisper Anunnaki, you repeat sounds pressed by the first writers 5 millennia ago. These weren't new words added centuries after civilization found its footing. They're embedded at the very start, proof that however they were imagined, their presence shaped the early architecture of human worship and record-keeping. Here lies the puzzle. The Anunnaki step into the scene not to manage one narrow sphere of thunder or healing. They arrive when destinies must be decreed. They are called upon when questions of balance arise, whether kings deserve thrones or when cosmic justice demands response. They are the backdrop of order itself. To think of them is to sense the machinery behind the surface, the underlying system that defines outcomes both divine and human. Imagine for a moment a king on the eve of his coronation. His hands tremble at the hem of his robe. Priests around him watch the night sky, scatter incense and read omens. Amid their chants, the Anunnaki are invoked. The rulers of fate themselves are asked to decide if this mortal should wear the crown. Flies hum in the torchlight. The king kneels. In the mythic imagination, far above, the council weighs their verdict. The man's reign might have length and strength only if approved by the sky being's collective nod. That was the atmosphere surrounding their name. These were not remote abstractions, floating too high to grasp. The tablets hint at direct points of meeting, at interactions where humans could encounter these sky offspring in formal rituals and decisions that shaped living kingdoms. Just as a judgment from a human assembly could bind entire cities, so too the decrees of the Anunnaki shaped the order not just of one people, but of existence itself. Because of this, we sense both their silence and their power. The Anunnaki's role is shadowy by design, never pinned down but always implied. They are guardians of balance rather than givers of gifts. They rule not by force but by decree. And woven through the earliest clay words is the reminder that their decisions were believed to reverberate across every domain of life. When a star appeared brighter, when a king rose, when floodwaters threatened, the Anunnaki assembly's hidden hand was imagined at work. Now, with this picture forming, we can say with care, these beings were never just stories to pass time by a fire. They were treated as cosmic elders whose approval everything depended upon, and the clay tablets do not leave them as distant entities. They lead us to the very places where their presence was sought and their rulings imagined. The old texts reveal where humans met them most tangibly, in the silent spaces of temple courts and sacred records, a meeting that waits for us to enter next. Imagine a small block of clay resting on a table beside a river. Its surface is soft, damp from the same waters that run through fields and towns. A hand leans in with a sharpened reed and presses slight wedges into the wet earth one mark at a time. These marks are not random. They form names, titles, even councils. This is where we see the Anunnaki enter the human record, not as faint ghost stories whispered around a fire, but written artifacts of a people who wanted their world preserved. In that moment, words stopped floating in the air and were bound into earth itself. The medium carried a paradox. These tablets were brittle. One wrong move and a crack could shatter the surface, and yet, when they survived fire or burial, they became almost permanent, turning fragile mud into vessels that lasted beyond kingdoms and languages. This contradiction mirrors the myths themselves. Stories that could vanish in a day also found ways to hold through centuries. The clay gave both weight and danger, meaning each sentence pressed into it was chosen with care. Nothing slipped by chance. Every sign was deliberate, shaped as if the words themselves were sacred offerings. The tablets we speak of didn't come from private homes. They were often hidden within temple archives, stacked in rooms where officials stored hymns, rituals and council decrees. Across places like Uruk, Nippur and Ur, scribes laboured over them by lamplight. A city might change its rulers or crumble under war, but temple libraries kept their rooms intact long enough for later excavators to discover lines that reached back across 5,000 years. These weren't bedtime stories written for casual comfort. They were institutional records written as part of sacred duty. To copy a hymn or spell out a divine name was as serious as lifting incense or pouring oil on an altar. Because of this setting, the act of writing itself was closer to a ritual. Pressed wedges shaped not just the language of memory, but the very foundation of authority. Imagine shaping a contract or reciting an oath, while also preserving the names of beings who are said to sit in council over the world. The process was not fast. The reed had to be pressed again and again in measured rows. The tablets themselves had to dry or be fired properly to endure. And yet out of this slow method grew one of the earliest archives of religion and law. The story of the Anunnaki, stamped across these surfaces, stood alongside lists of offerings, temple inventories, and accounts of kingship. References to the Anunnaki don't appear in random notes. They're embedded within hymns tied to festivals, ceremonies performed to confirm the world's order, and rituals meant to fix human fates before they unfolded. In other words, their names belong to the most solemn acts of the culture. When a priest called upon them during a festival, it was through lines first measured into clay. When a king sought approval of his rule, those prayers were fused with the same written syllables. The temple wasn't just a place of worship, but a hub where religion, politics, and economy intertwined. That is why the role of the Anunnaki can't be pried away from civic life. If we fast forward, a strange link appears. The very same wedge-shaped signs once carved in wet clay now shine as pixels on glowing screens. What a scribe once struggled to copy in a quiet chamber, you can now scroll through in seconds, stored in vast digital archives. These databases act like modern temples of knowledge, linking us back across deep time to the hands that pressed each mark. This stretch across millennia makes the simple reed strokes no less personal. Every tablet remains an act where a human chose to preserve long after their own voice would be gone. Think for a moment about how this continuity was secured. In ancient schools of scribal training, boys, some barely more than children, sat indoors with clay blocks on their laps. Their task was not just to write language, but to repeat lines until the muscle memory fixed them within. By copying lists of gods and ceremonies, they guaranteed the names would not vanish. A student in 1800 BCE might not know what those divine councils looked like, but by scratching their syllables into clay, he gave them new life. Generation after generation, this practice kept the chain intact until it reached the excavators of modern times. When we read about the Anunnaki today, we don't draw from a single narrative. Instead, we see fragments. Some tablets speak of them as judges of the dead. Others place them as counselors of the sky. Another may align them with ceremonies fixing destinies for kings. This variety makes them appear inconsistent to us, but it also points to their adaptability. They were called upon in whichever role the ritual required. The same group could operate as underworld rulers one day and sky arbiters the next. Far from being chaos, this fluidity showed a structure responsive to what human society needed at the time. It is striking to notice how survival of the physical text became survival of the idea itself. If those fragile blocks had been left unconserved, the names would have vanished. Villages could be buried by flood, and oral stories fade into silence. But baked clay retains its grooves, often long after wood or cloth disappears. Without the patient copying and storing inside temple houses, our understanding of these beings would not exist. The endurance of their myth is grounded not just in human memory, but in the simple fact that clay, once hardened, can endure in soil for ages. Each city that preserved them did so with purpose. Uruk, Nippur, and Ur were not arbitrary places. They were hubs of both power and devotion, springs of authority for their societies. Stumbling across texts in these locations later was not just chance archaeology. It showed how embedded the myth was into the very systems that organized Mesopotamian daily life. You cannot speak of the Anunnaki without also speaking of the temples where decisions of agriculture, tribute, and kingship pass through the same hands recording myths onto tablets. So as we picture those small rectangles of clay lined across ancient shelves, we see more than objects. We see the bridge that kept stories alive. A reed stylus pressed lines into damp earth and by accident or by design, they survived thousands of years. And because they survived, we can still speak of the Anunnaki as if waiting in record. The scribes who worked so carefully left a legacy heavier than they knew. From here, another question rises. Now that we understand where these stories live, in palm-sized blocks, in temple libraries, in modern digital archives, we can begin to ask what those words themselves actually contained. What, according to the tablets, did the Anunnaki do once their names were pressed into clay? The fires at Nippur crackle in the winter dark. Priests gather in the temple court chanting words that rise with the smoke. The sound is steady, ritualistic, meant for ears beyond human reach. They call on the 7 who decree fate. They summon the 50 great Anunnaki. In their recitation, the year ahead is submitted to divine authority, as if even time itself needs approval before it can move forward. This was not just symbolic pageantry. For Mesopotamians, it was a political act, rooted in the idea that the universe had rulers, officers, and a governing body above all else. At the heart of this structure stood 3 names. Anu, the Sky Father, presided as ultimate source of law. Enlil, Lord of Earth and Storm, carried out executive power, holding the authority to punish or protect. And Enki, Master of Waters and Wisdom, served as problem solver and mediator. The 3 formed a triad. Each carried distinct domains, yet none alone decided the shape of reality. They functioned like a balance at the very summit of cosmic order. Under them, assemblies of the Anunnaki met in chambers both imagined and ritually invoked, a divine council whose workings mirrored the political systems of early cities. It is tempting to think of gods as chaotic, each acting in sudden bursts of passion. But what emerges from these texts is different. The Anunnaki acted as if bound by rules. They debated, they weighed options, they issued judgments through procedure. Their decisions resemble the slow grind of government more than the whims of spirits. In songs and hymns, their chambers are described as orderly, with appointed roles, witnesses, speakers, and jurors. Fates were fixed in the same way laws or verdicts are fixed within a court. The divine mirrored the social, and the social mirrored the divine. So let's walk into that imagined chamber. Anu seated on a great throne, silent until the moment calls for authority. To his right, Enlil, restless, stern, a figure who drives action. To the left, Enki, voice of mediation, ready with clever solutions. Around them the Anunnaki sit in rows, careful and deliberate, each representing powers and regions, each with a vote to cast. It is a world where even gods do not act alone. All decisions pass through the gathering, as if existence itself demands consultation before change can occur. Why should this matter so much? Because councils were woven into daily life. Kings called upon elders to deliberate, villages relied on assemblies to administer justice, and law codes framed authority as granted from above. The Anunnaki, then, were not distant abstractions. They were living reflections of the same communal order that governed Mesopotamian towns. To call them the elders of the divine realm was not metaphor but description. They legitimated every project and every throne, showing people that the structure of their own world was mirrored in the heavens. One of the most striking moments comes in the story of the flood. The assembly meets with tension thick in the chamber. Enlil presses for silence across Earth. Humanity has grown too loud, their villages crying through the night, disturbing the cosmic rest. He demands destruction. Yet Enki counters, calling for moderation. Humankind, he argues, is flawed but necessary, and their lives sustain the temple offerings the gods rely upon. The debate is heated, the council divided. In the end, the assembly sides with Enlil decreeing the deluge, but Enki, bound yet cunning, finds a way to whisper warnings to Atrahasis, ensuring the survival of life. Judgment, mercy, betrayal. All unfolded not in isolation but through procedure of counsel. Another view comes through Inanna's descent. When the goddess of love and war journeys into the realm below, she is confronted not by one ruler, but by the gathered Anunnaki sitting as judges. They strip her power, they fix her fate, and they enforce the unbreakable law of death. Even a goddess is subject to their decision. Here again, the principle emerges. No one, not even the divine elite, escapes assembly rule. Destiny is not the whim of one god. It is collective decree, issued in solemn silence and carried into action with terrifying weight. To imagine what this meant, think of a king preparing for coronation. He kneels inside Nippur's sacred temple as priestly voices call down the Anunnaki. Candles throw shadows across the baked brick walls. Above him, in the mythic vision of the culture, the council sits in deliberation. Will they grant approval? Will this mortal's rule align with their cosmic balance? The king waits, trembling, as his destiny is measured not by his personal ambition, but by the agreement of unseen arbiters. The council's word becomes his crown. Destiny in Mesopotamia was never thought of as random or chaotic. It wasn't a fickle thread in the hands of moody deities. It was decision-making carried out through a divine assembly that patterned itself on human procedure. The Anunnaki promised structure. They made existence feel secure, not because it offered perfect outcomes, but because even in destruction there was form, deliberation, and rationale. To the people of those lands, this meant reality itself was governed by order, not by chance. Think about how radically that shapes life. For farmers watching weather, for rulers issuing decrees, for priests reciting omens, every act existed against the backdrop of a cosmic bureaucracy. The fire crackled in Nippur, but in the imagination a council chamber extended high above and deep below. That sense of layered governance stitched heaven, earth, and underworld into one system of deliberation. And from here, the story bends downwards. For if the Anunnaki could fix fates in the sky, they also sat in grim rows beneath the earth. Their chamber existed not only above but in the realm where all journeys end. Every mortal and even certain gods would face their gaze there. Order, it turns out, did not stop at death's threshold. It continued, waiting, silent, unavoidable, in the underworld halls where the Anunnaki kept their stern watch. So let's imagine a hall where even gods tremble. Inanna, once clothed in the power of love and war, stripped of every ornament and protection, arrives barefoot at the first of 7 gates. By the time she passes through the last, she is naked. Her strength dissolved like clay in water. She walks onward into the land of no return. There, torchlight flickers but never holds. Dust settles thick on the floor. Bread is made of clay. The air moves heavy as if weighed down by dirt itself. And waiting in long silent rows are the Anunnaki, the judges of the dead. The underworld was not a pit of fire or a paradise of reward. It was a place of stillness and shadow. The cuneiform tablets say it plainly. The dead eat dust. They drink from clay vessels. They wander beneath a ceiling of rock. Life above continues in the floodplains. Barley ripens. Children play by canals. But below, nothing changes. It is a mirror world stripped bare of harvest and laughter. And seated at the heart of this stark reflection are the Anunnaki, rulers not through storm or war, but through verdict. The paradox is striking. These are the same figures who appear in the sky, weighing whether kings will rule, deciding the fate of harvests, calculating the balance of floods and peace. Yet in the nether halls, these beings serve as magistrates of death. Their eyes are described as the gaze of death, eyes that even Inanna cannot meet. A goddess who commands armies in the living realm cannot bend their judgment. Here, the sky's council becomes the underworld's bench, and even divine power crumbles into silence. So let's picture their hall. The tablets imagine stone benches lined up in formation as if a cosmic courtroom. The judges sit with faces fixed, not cruel, not soft, but carved by permanence. In life, kings may beg, priests may chant, the living can argue their place before temples. But in this chamber, the soul's destiny is beyond persuasion. Every mortal crosses the threshold, and each arrival faces the same trial. The verdict, silent, stern, constant, must be accepted. The cultural weight of this was immense. For the people of Sumer or Babylon, death was not random or chaotic. It was systematic. A process was in place and could not be ignored. The Anunnaki's role made mortality feel like an ordered step in the chain of existence. To fear death was natural. To understand it as structured, as subject to ruling rather than whim, was perhaps more terrifying. You could not charm them. You could not escape their gaze, but you could prepare. And so burial cakes were made, offerings placed, prayers whispered. Families worked to ease the way of the soul into that silent court. We return to Inanna's story. She stands before them powerless, judged without appeal. Their sentence is sharp. Inanna is struck down and hung upon a hook like a carcass in a storeroom. The goddess who once claimed kingdoms hangs as lifeless flesh. Even divinity bends at the knees when the 7 judges of death deliver their sentence. For those who listen to this myth, the message was clear. No rank or power shields anyone from the cosmic law. But the story continues. Enki, Lord of Wisdom, sends messengers carved from dirt and life water to rescue her. They slip into the underworld unnoticed, sprinkle the seed of life on her corpse, and bring her back to breath. Yet her return carries a price. Cosmic balance must not bend so far without payment. The Anunnaki decree a substitution. Another must stay below if Inanna rises, and so attention turns to Dumuzi, her consort. Dumuzi's capture becomes part of the rhythm of the seasons, half the cycle above, half below. When he is taken, fields shrivel. Grief spreads across shepherd huts and barley lands. When he returns, the meadows recover, lambs grow strong, grain rises tall. His fate shadows the very breath of the landscape. The Anunnaki thus link judgment not only to individuals but to all cycles. Life and decay, joy and sorrow, each aligned with their decrees. The myth explains why balance matters. It is not cruelty that places Dumuzi in chains each season, but necessity. Without his descent, the earth would lack rest. Crops would never pause. The soil would never regain its strength. To live is to die. To die is to return in different form. The judges enforce that law. They are not only keepers of death, but of the pivot between growth and stillness. Now picture a family near They carry a wrapped body to a pit outside the city wall. They lay bread beside it, pour water over the soil, whispering words so old their origins blur. What they seek is not escape for their kin, but mercy. Let the Anunnaki judge gently. Let the stern faces in shadowed halls pass a verdict of belonging. Death rituals, uncovered by archaeologists in graves lined with vessels and offerings, are echoes of those hopes. Each gift carried the same plea: may order continue, may death be a passage, not a fall into chaos. That is the deep current beneath these myths. The Anunnaki stand as arbiters both in heaven and below, folding all existence inside their structure. When skies gather for fate or shadows judge the dead, their function remains constant: to decree, to decide, to anchor life and death inside boundaries that withstand time. And yet the story reminds us of an unsettling continuity. From sky to soil, from throne to grave, the same cosmic council waits. The transition is severe, but the logic is identical. Whether blessing rulers or binding corpses, the Anunnaki enforce order. Next, their decrees will shape not only the end of life, but the cycle of the seasons themselves, ensuring that balance is never broken and that every rise is answered by a fall. Inanna came back from the land of no return, but not unchanged. She stepped through the gates alive, her eyes hollow with what she had seen, her body still marked by the touch of death. For the first time, the borders had been crossed without payment. The cosmic order tilted, and in that tilt the Anunnaki sat silent for a moment, weighing what had just happened. If a god could descend into the shadowed halls and rise again without cost, then the deepest law no longer held. Their world, like ours, ran on exchange. Nothing was created without loss, and nothing returned without a trade. The Mesopotamians knew this through the soil. The barley that fed their cities grew tall only because last year's seed had decayed in darkness. The rains filled the canals only when the dry season had already claimed the fields. The idea that Inanna could emerge free threatened this rhythm. If death could be escaped, then the balance of planting and harvest, of growth and decay, would collapse. The Anunnaki issued their decision with the same coldness they had in the Underworld courtroom. Balance must be restored. Someone must take Inanna's place below, not as punishment, but as correction. Their gaze settled on Dumuzi, the shepherd king and her lover. His fault was not only timing, but attitude. He had not mourned her descent, had not honoured the gravity of her absence. That failure, in the logic of myth, sealed his fate. In stories told along the Euphrates, demons were sent to seize him, the Gala who carried orders without question. You can picture him fleeing into the marshes, waist-deep in reeds, his breath fast as the hunters closed in. He raced through barley fields, reaching for the stalks as if the earth itself could protect him. He begged river spirits for shelter and animals of the plain for help, but each turned away or remained silent. When the cosmic assembly decrees an outcome, no creature dares intervene. The capture came quickly, as myths often deliver their blows. Dumuzi was dragged into the earth's depth. Above, shepherds watched their flocks with unease. They knew what followed. The pastures would dry, lambs would weaken, the green edge of spring would fade too soon. The loss of their divine protector was not symbolic. It mirrored the collapse of growth they saw in their own herds and fields. For people who lived by cycles of rain and germination, the myth read like an explanation of inevitable decline. Into this grief stepped Inanna, Dumuzi's sister. In the story, she didn't resist but offered herself as substitute. She volunteered to divide the year, 6 months beneath, 6 months above. That way her brother could return, and the earth would not wither in endless winter. Her act did not erase the Anunnaki's law. It reinterpreted it, softening the hard edge of balance with compassion. By alternating their fates, the cycle of seasons gained its form. Mesopotamian farmers did not need scribes to explain what this meant. Each year they saw barley stalks grow tall again after lying dormant. Each year trees leafed and shed, goats birthed young, then slowed in the dry heat. Life itself was measured in this exchange. To them, Dumuzi's descent was not tragic fantasy. It was recognition that death maintained the line of life, and that the return of fertility was a gift bought with absence. The community kept the memory through ritual. In temples, women let down their hair, loosened their garments, and sang laments for Dumuzi. Their voices carried the tone of mourning, repeating his name as if to keep him alive. This was no theatre. It was a necessary act, a way to cooperate with the verdict of the gods. When his return was celebrated later, songs reversed sorrow into praise. In mourning and rejoicing, the people aligned themselves with the cosmic pattern. From one angle, the judgment seems cruel. Why condemn a god to death for failing to weep at the right moment? Why demand substitution as payment for life regained? But that is not how the story functioned. Its weight was in clarity. The universe runs on rules larger than any one being. The Anunnaki expressed this through decision, binding even gods to the terms of exchange. Harshness was paired with continuity. Through their decrees, the seasons turned, the soil revived, animals birthed, and fields bore grain again. Think of it as a ledger kept by invisible rulers. When Inanna returned above, a space opened in the balance sheet. It had to be filled. The entry bore Dumuzi's name. His sacrifice and Inanna's kindness ensured that the account balanced once more. That logic, recited through chants and lived through harvests, shaped the Mesopotamian sense of stability. They accepted mortality because it kept the wheel turning. The myth also reached into private lives. Losing a loved one could be understood as part of the same rhythm. A family might bury a child or parent and picture the Anunnaki judges adjusting the scales. In grief, they found a difficult reassurance. The loss was not arbitrary, but woven into the same cycle that promised spring grain. The Anunnaki ensured that chaos did not win, even if their verdicts wounded deeply. This story is one layer in a wider vision of cosmic order that spanned many centuries. We can see how, for the ancient world, death was not a final break, but a shared necessity that even divinity endured. Dumuzi's time below brought fertility above. Inanna's compassion divided darkness with light. The land itself breathed with them, and farming people felt their own lives pulled into that breath. Through these decrees, the Anunnaki shaped not only myth, but also how fields were tended, how rituals were performed, how families mourned and hoped. Their authority was present in each germinating seed, each fading pasture, and each return of greenery after winter rains. What looks harsh in story becomes structure in life, a guarantee that renewal would follow decay. And so when torches were lifted in summer festivals or laments whispered in dim courtyards, the people of Sumer aligned themselves again with the cosmic decree. They acknowledged loss in order to invite return. They gave voice to sorrow so that joy might come back. In their songs and fields alike, the balance held firm. From here, the myths take us deeper into the underworld. Because for the Anunnaki, judgment did not end with the seasons. It extended to the fate of every soul, waiting in the silent halls of the land of no return, where another verdict awaited beyond all earthly cycles. Picture the sound of shovels hitting soil, steady and rhythmic, layer by layer under the Mesopotamian sun. But these are not human hands digging. These are the Iggy, junior gods pressed into endless work. They stand along the Tigris with baskets heavy on their backs. Their shoulders ache with centuries of labour that never ends, moving mud to shape the earth into rivers, canals and banks that hold back the floods. You can almost hear their breath turn ragged, a reminder that even immortals can grow tired when service becomes their only identity. For ages, the Iggy had taken on the burden of the world's maintenance. They dredged the riverbeds to keep water flowing to the reeds. They shaped canals that carried life into dry plains where crops would one day grow. They hauled earth by the basketful until their arms blistered, and their divinity itself felt burned down into weariness. This work was not choice, it was decree. Across deep time, toil and exhaustion piled like silt inside them, until revolt was the only thought left. The breaking point arrived one endless day. When the sun bore down hardest, the Iggy paused. They exchanged exhausted glances, a silent vote building among them. Then, in unison, they lowered their baskets. Tools clattered against the ground, unfinished channels left half-shaped. As one body, they marched away from their labour and toward Enlil's great house. No longer silent, their voices rose like fire in dry grass, demanding an end to what they had been forced to do. It was a strike in divine form, a rebellion of workers who laid claim to their right not to be worked past breaking. Imagine mud-smeared gods shouting at the doors of Enlil's chambers, symbols of defiance as stark as abandoned spades in the dirt. For the first time, maintenance of the cosmos itself ground to a halt. Canals clogged and dried, irrigation paths backed up. The fragile infrastructure that fed the cradle of civilization began to decay. What came next was assembly. Anu, high in the hierarchy, sat in judgment alongside Enlil and Enki. The Anunnaki council gathered, their debate reflecting the weight of human councils below. This was no myth of chance happenings, no wild contest of storms and love. It was procedure, deliberation, arguments, responsibility distributed in a patterned form. The senior gods looked down from their secure realm at the sight of the earth below slipping back toward chaos, canals silting without maintenance. Enlil fumed. His view was practical. If junior gods rebelled once, they would do so again. Order in his mind required force. Resentful murmurs could not be tolerated. But Anu, listening to the collective cry, heard something deeper. The truth that exhaustion could wear even immortality thin. And Enki, the sharp thinker among them, whispered a new path. He spoke of a substitute, fashioned from the very matter the Iggy worked with, shaped by hand and sustained by ritual. Enki's solution was radical. Take clay from the riverbanks, substance from which pots and bricks were made. Mix it with divine essence borrowed from the spirits themselves. Shape from that mixture a new kind of creature, one that would carry out the abandoned tasks. Humans would be designed to serve the very functions the Iggy refused. They would dig, dredge, carry and maintain, not gods, but workers. Not divine, but mixed with just enough spark to obey commands and survive the hard land. The plan reflected the Mesopotamian worldview. Humanity was not made out of love, nor to celebrate divine kindness. Humanity was created as infrastructure in flesh. Practicality stood at the root of existence. Just as every city required irrigation ditches, brick kilns and temple staff, so too did the gods require a labour force. Creation here was not a song of beauty, but an answer to a work stoppage, a staffing problem that called for immediate remedy. That tells us something striking about how Mesopotamian people imagined their place in the world. In other mythic traditions, creation flows from love, conflict or cosmic poetry. But in the Atrahasis epic, the motive is clear. Humans were born to labour because the work had to be done and someone had to do it. That is a worldview brought directly from daily experience. Every crop depended on muddy hands keeping water in motion, and every house rested on someone hauling brick after brick. Picture the scene in Enki's workshop along the marshes. Clay is scooped from the riverbank, still wet. It is kneaded, not unlike dough for bread, but thicker, heavier with divine energy woven in. The shaping is done carefully, piece by piece, until a form rises. A body emerges, fragile compared to the gods, yet strong enough for toil. Lungs fill with the first breath, eyes flutter open. From the mire, through deliberate craft, rises the first human being, blinking in shock at sunlight. Now, with this form constructed, the Anunnaki watch with satisfaction. The agreement has been completed. The labour moved downward. The protests of the Iggy find their resolution, not through compromise with their masters, but through the invention of a new class of beings to shoulder what they could not endure. And so humans stood, not at the centre of creation or at the pinnacle of design, but at the base of the chain, ordained for service. This is what makes the rebellion so revealing. Even gods could turn against duty when it became too much, but humanity was engineered with boundaries to prevent the same. Weakness was part of the design. Hunger and death ensured humans would cycle through generations, never gaining enough permanence to challenge authority fully. Their limitation was deliberate, written into their very bodies. And yet, what began here would echo forward. Because in solving the labour revolt with clay and breath, the council opened a door that could not be sealed. Thinking beings had been made, with minds as well as hands. They could obey, but also ask questions. They could work, but also dream. What would that mean for those who wished them only to be servants? From the strike of the Iggy to the shaping of flesh from mud, the Atrahasis story shows us a pattern both stark and enduring. Power seeks structure, structure demands workers, and workers, whether divine or human, can reach limits that force the world to transform. With the burden shifted and the canals filled once more, the balance held, for now. But the creation designed to solve one crisis carried in its clay the seeds of new questions. Questions the Anunnaki themselves would not be able to avoid. Picture a potter's wheel in slow motion, its clay rising in quiet spirals. In ancient this was more than craft. It was a mirror for existence itself. The Mesopotamian view of life began at this wheel, with wet earth coaxed into shape under steady hands. To them, humanity's own beginning was not sparked by passion or divine affection, but through practical design, a solution crafted much like a vessel is shaped. The old texts say we were fashioned in mud mixed with something more, clay rain-soaked from the riverbeds combined with essence from the realm above. Clay mattered here in every sense. The very foundations of their cities, from the monumental ziggurats that climbed against the desert sky down to the humblest cooking pot, were pulled from the alluvial banks of the Euphrates and Tigris. Civilizations literally stood on mud brick. When scribes pressed wedges into the same material to track debts, hymns or star movements, they were not only inscribing memory, they were reaffirming a worldview that life and culture both rose out of this simple, pliant medium. If humans themselves had sprung from it, as the myth said, then civilization was nothing more than clay elevated and shaped into order. What set humanity apart in these stories was not their form of clay, it was the infusion. Some texts claim a god was sacrificed, his blood kneaded into the mixture so that mortals bore traces of divine spark within fragile shells. That detail introduces a paradox. We were meant to lift burdens and keep canals flowing, yet inside us flickered the very traits that led the gods themselves to rebel. Work and defiance became twin inheritances, inseparable from the moment of our beginning. You can almost sense the unease in this choice, to fashion labourers strong enough to build empires but restless enough to question their chains. The image of the workshop crystallises this point. Near Eridu, stories speak of a sterile complex where first models emerged, not in clouds of light but with the careful steps of a craftsman perfecting tools. Names like Adamu appear in this strand, depicted not as the beloved children of gods, but as prototypes for a new category of being. Their making looked less like enchantment and more like engineering. Stir the clay, mix in the fragment of divinity, shape limbs, enable them to eat, sleep, and plough. Nothing romantic shadows this account. These creations were workers first, worshippers second. Yet their design could not be limitless. Mortality was fixed at the start. Fragility was chosen. The hunger that drives humans to fields each dawn, the weariness that folds bodies at night, none of this was mistake. These features kept humans dependent, strong enough to raise walls and clear reed marshes, but weak enough to need gods for direction. The texts leave little uncertainty on this point. Features that we today might call flaws were safeguards, preventing another revolt like the one that forced this invention in the first place. To see why, remember the world from which the story comes. Unlike myths that exalt humanity as pinnacle of creation, here humans exist as a workforce. Temples and shrines made this clear each morning. Priests carried bread, poured beer, left lambs or dates upon altars. These offerings rose not as gifts of courtesy, but as payments, a quiet transaction, a fulfillment of contract, mirroring the original accord that bound men and women to divine burden. Work for them, feed them, maintain order through service. Each bowl set down on an altar became part of that primordial deal. From this angle, daily routines lose their quiet mundanity. At dawn in Uruk, smoke drifted from temple kitchens long before the sun cleared the horizon. Farmers shouldered tools toward canals still damp with fog. Children gathered scraps of reed for fuel. Scribes scratched on clay tablets by lamplight in shaded courtyards. Each of these actions, mundane in themselves, echoed the primordial decree. To labour and to serve was the condition for human life. No moment was neutral. The very act of existing meant carrying the load once held by gods. Clay was everywhere, and because of that, the creation myth resonated more strongly. Every brick touched in building mirrored the legend of man moulded from earth. Each pressed tablet repeated that same rhythm. Shape soft material, let it harden, allow it to endure centuries if fire sealed it. Civilization itself unfolded like one long echo of the first act of mixing clay with blood. The substance of the earth became the substance of society. This vision shaped law too. Justice was seen less as abstract fairness and more as management of obligations within cosmic order. A worker was not simply hired by a master. His role itself echoed the whole arrangement between gods and humans. Authority was justified because from the start humans had been designed to obey rhythms, to keep channels flowing, harvest steady and offerings consistent. City walls may have separated Uruk from the fields beyond, but within both alike the contract held steady, labour below so that peace above could remain. In this we glimpse how Mesopotamian thought managed continuity. Inheritance of work, inheritance of worship, all set in place by creators before humanity even drew its first breath. No festival or ceremony escaped this pattern. Even funerals carried echoes. The loss of one life was a reminder that mortality itself had been designed, a feature necessary for keeping balance. Death became part of the larger system, an intentional measure to prevent mankind from swelling beyond control. Seen from our distance, the story carries its weight differently. It does not paint humanity as weak accident, nor as chosen highlight of existence. Instead, it places us within machinery of order, a practical necessity. A species begun in clay so that irrigation might continue, bricks might stack, temples might glow with fire. That may sound utilitarian, but remember, from such service rose writing, astronomy, agriculture, and the city itself. From that beginning, civilization surged forward, carrying ideas that shaped the ancient world and still ripple into our own. So the potter's wheel turns, clay rising steady, soft under pressure, hardening into shape with each spin. Each vessel testifies to the same lesson. Humans were crafted tools within a vast plan. We were not meant to command, but to perpetuate. With this understanding in place, we can see how the role humans accepted, working in fields, feeding altars, soon produced consequences greater than the gods predicted. Their numbers swelled, their voices grew, and in that swelling lay the seeds of another crisis the Anunnaki would have to face. The sound of the ancient cities was not silence. Imagine settling down after nightfall along the Euphrates and hearing not the calm hush of reeds, but a restless murmur that carried through the dark. Wooden wheels screeched as carts rolled over hard-packed soil. Hammers worked in steady rhythm as builders raised roofs, dogs barked, and children cried, their voices echoing down narrow lanes. The Anunnaki, who once imagined humans as quiet labourers tending canals and fields, listened in their high domain to this flood of noise. It pressed upward like steam, a rising chorus they had not intended when they first shaped clay into living breath. For Mesopotamians, cities marked achievement, but they also held tension. A farmer bent over river mud heard not only frogs and insects after dusk, but also laughter, prayer, quarrels, and songs drifting on the wind. Multiply that scene across hundreds of villages becoming towns, and the pulse of human life began to shake the order of the cosmos. The gods had carried the weight of labour before humanity existed, and then humans were made to ease that strain. But in easing it, they multiplied faster than expected, until the world was crowded with clamor. The voices were evidence of independence, and for Enlil, chief among the powers, the sound was an insult to order itself. So picture the council chamber lit by fire. Enlil pacing with strained breath, his words sharp, declaring that humans had slipped beyond the role assigned to them. To him, they were not workers anymore. They were intruders filling the night with din. Around him, others listened in silence, the crack of torches casting shadows against stone. Anu sat still, measuring the weight of the complaint. The assembly faced a question larger than any decree before. Did this rapid swell of voices prove success or failure? Was creation too loud for its own good? Some nodded with Enlil. In his words, they heard not only complaint but concern. A balance had tipped. The cosmos, once measured by the rhythms of stars and the rising of rivers, now bent to the unmeasured noise of a creature that should have been contained. Others in the council shifted uneasily. They saw vitality rather than threat. Many eyes turned to Enki, god of wisdom and water, known to temper strict rulings with thought. He stayed quiet, his silence a signal that dissent brewed, but not open yet. The debate was not a burst of rage, it was a weighing of scales. And yet, the verdict came. Just as in deep time they had solved the rebellion of the lesser gods by creating humans from clay, so now they turned to another solution. One final measure to clear the slate. A flood would come, not water for fields, but a surge to erase voices. The decree spread through the celestial assembly, carried by nods and sighs, a gesture of inevitability. A flood would pour down from the open skies and shattered rivers, sweeping away this noisy creation, restoring silence to the chambers above. But silence rarely holds. In the long tradition of stories, one figure stands against decree. Under cover of night, Enki leaned near a reed wall and spoke. He did not face Atrahasis, the man chosen, directly, but his words seeped through the wall's thin ribs. Instructions passed as though whispered to the mud and carried into ears. Build a boat, make it a cube, seal it with tar from riverbeds, bring the seed of life aboard. Enki fractured loyalty in favour of compassion, weighing his own wisdom against the consensus of gods. That moment marked the divide between blind decree and quiet resistance. Now imagine the yard of Atrahasis, neighbours watching as workers lifted timbers into square frames, strange in size and shape, not a vessel for trade or reed fishing along canals, but a cube sealed with black pitch. They laughed, thought him mad, yet animals began to gather, sheep pressed together, birds fluttering in cages, oxen tied at the gate. A small crowd watched wagons roll with food and seeds, the air thick with doubt. All the while the sky darkened as though holding a secret. Then rain came, not gentle rain but walls of water that fell and kept falling. Rivers swelled, banks broke loose, torrents surged down streets. Ziggurat steps vanished under waves, temple towers drowned. Villagers knelt on rooftops that soon split beneath them. Cattle vanished into whirls of current, and only the cube, bitumen thick on every seam, floated steady against collapse. Atrahasis and his kin listened to roaring water where once only the cries of neighbours existed. The world turned blank. Even sacred high terraces sank beneath endless flood. In the Atrahasis telling, this deluge did not end with triumph. When the vessel grounded at last and the doors opened, the landscape was raw mud and silence of another kind, the silence of absence. Atrahasis built an altar and set fire to an offering, smoke curling into pale sky. Then came the gods, drawn by scent, hungry as flies. They who ordered the death of humans found their mouths watering, their stomachs echoing. They circled the little altar in desperation, realizing they needed the lives and sacrifices of humans more than humans needed their decrees. That irony struck deep. Dependence flowed upward, not only downward. Because of this, another council formed after the horror. New measures appeared. Human life was kept, but with rules altered. Lifespans shortened so numbers would not soar unchecked. Mortality rose more often in infancy, a harsh brake on crowded voices. Ritual obligations tightened, ensuring steady offerings. The contract between earth and sky shifted into something less fragile yet more demanding. Where before humans had been workers to ease divine fatigue, they were now partners in an uneasy balance, their lives limited but essential. In this way, the Great Flood became more than a punishment. It was a cosmic rebalancing. A noisy humanity had forced the gods into confrontation with their own dependence, and the waters wrote a line between old creation and new order. The clamours of carts and children did not vanish forever. They grew again, but under boundaries carved by both decree and compassion. From here the story asks us to notice what survived. Not silence, not ruin, but contract. The Anunnaki's need for offerings ensured human survival, though bound in rules as binding as floodwaters. And so the flood was not the end. It was the resetting of measures. Shorter lives, ritual laws, and limits on growth carried forward, like ledgers after debt has been stricken but not erased. Cities rose once more along riverbanks, this time with memories of drowned towers under them. The gods had reasserted control, but also acknowledged their dependence. In that uneasy agreement, life continued, with both boundaries and voices echoing across clay-brick streets. The reeds along the river move gently in the dawn wind. Out of the dark water a cloaked figure rises, his body half hidden by scales that glimmer like fish skin. In his hands he carries a woven basket pressed to his chest. Within it lies not grain nor reeds, but scrolls marked with the seed of wisdom. On the bank of the river a king waits, the first ruler of Eridu, his feet sunk in wet earth, staring toward the strange visitor as if the morning itself had sent him. The quiet moment carries the weight of a contract, for the figure is no fisherman nor a priest, but what later people would call an apkalu, a sage sent across the boundary between divine and human to shape the earliest age after ruin. These sages were never rulers in their own right. They did not grip sceptres or lead armies through the floodplain. Instead, their role was to carry gifts of order from the hidden realm of the gods into the fragile new world. In the stories there are 7 of them. They walk not as Anunnaki themselves, but as extensions of that unearthly order. Messengers chosen to give, but with careful boundaries. Their wisdom is meant to rebuild, not to replace. They thread the gap between the councils in the heavens and the rulers on the ground, standing between command and obedience, neither above nor below human kingship, but forever guiding it. Imagine the first task of one of these sages. The waters of destruction have lowered. Earth is soft with silt, temples reduced to mud, houses splintered. A king kneels by the cornerstone of a new foundation, his hand shaking as he looks across his empty city. A figure kneels beside him, scaled cloak damp from river spray. The sage takes the king's hand and places it against the stone. With a slow movement, he guides the finger to trace out lines, angles, geometry, that align not just with land and water but with stars overhead. Every brick that will be laid will echo this celestial plan. The temple rising from clay will not stand as mere shelter, but as a copy of cosmic pattern, blessed because it mirrors the heavens. In this act, power descends, kingship drawn down into mud and mortar, set in alignment with unseen decree. In Mesopotamian thought, leadership did not rise from battle or vote. It came down, like a light lowered from above. The Apkallu were the instruments that carried this light to rulers and ensured the connection held. Without them, the bond between earth and sky would fray. With them, every decision of authority could be seen as sanctioned, woven into the same fabric that held the skies in motion. Governance itself stood as a branch of cosmic rhythm, not mere human invention, but a channel through which the divine plan kept its order alive. We can picture the wider scenes that followed. Within temples, scribes sit cross-legged, clay tablets damp before them. Their styluses of reed scratch wedge by wedge, while a sage mutters the proper way to form each mark. A hymn of devotion is written beside a table of numbers. Multiplication and sacred names share the same clay. In this way, the earliest mathematics and the earliest worship are melded into one duty, each sign pressed as a token of divine knowledge. Writing was not simply a technical tool, it was a sacred rhythm, the very memory of the gods passed through human hands. That these skills endure at all is because sages carried their weight into human muscle, into daily repetition, into habits that still echo when we trace language today. Their image as fish-cloaked beings ties them to waters that were thought to cradle the world. The Apsu, the vast deep beneath the earth, was the home of Enki, lord of wisdom, keeper of secrets. Emerging from such waters, the sages appear drenched in power older than soil. The scales shimmer not as costume but as reminder. This wisdom flows upward from depth, not outward from men. Like springs that bubble from hidden rock, the teachings carried by the Apkallu rise from sources unseen. In their fish-cloaked forms we glimpse a living link between the deep reservoir of cosmic pattern and the fragile surface where humans struggle to build. Consider the practical bread of their teaching. On Uruk's walls, with the sun setting red across the plain, a sage stands beside builders and officials. He raises his arm, pointing toward empty marsh and dry channels where a canal could run. He speaks of measure, of water flow, of how walls must bend if grain is to feed the city. Engineers lean close, drawing lines in dust, repeating his words. What is set down is more than engineering. It is balance turned into earthworks, maps shaped by divine ratio. The irrigation that will feed thousands begins as a thought passed from river-born figure to mortal hands. By nightfall, plans are marked, bricks will be laid, and the water will move again as fields take root. When we gather the stories, a pattern appears. The Anunnaki function not as wandering individuals but as councils, judges, overseers. In parallel, they send sages not as rulers but as teachers, careful that authority lines remain intact. Knowledge is given, but kingship is confirmed by heavens. Humans are guided, but the order remains vertical. What might sound like myth echoes a principle of structure itself, the belief that civilization cannot emerge from chaos but must be handed down with measure, guided step by step. Even in destruction, there are agents to rebuild along proper lines, and so we find ourselves standing with that king on the riverbank, watching a figure climb up from depths into dawn light, carrying wisdom in his arms. He will not wear a crown, he will not march with troops. Yet the city he helps design, the script he passes to scribes, the rites he reveals to priests, all of them will secure the bond that ties humans to cosmic order. From their hands, civilization rises, half divine, half clay. Because of them, floods recede not into formless ruin but into rebuilt fields and steepled shrines. This rhythm of instruction, of shaping human space through divine measure, continues through city after city, ruler after ruler. The sages vanish back into waters, but their lessons persist in bricks, canals, tablets, and rituals. Just as gods assemble in councils to steward the universe, so too human society grows under appointed teachers. And from here, the next question waits. If wisdom travels from deep water to temple stone, what happens when those gifts are bound into sacred contracts, formal deeds that shape not just rulers, but every act of daily life? The river is still dark in the hour before sunrise. A slim boat glides over the surface, its reed hull whispering through the water. Under woven mats lies a hidden cargo, not grain, not gold, but glowing tablets of power called the me. To the people who told these stories, these were not ideas or symbols. They were real objects, carried, traded, and sometimes stolen. They were the orders of the gods themselves, the blueprints on which every city and every ritual depended. The me covered the full span of human life. They contained the gift of kingship, the weight of law, the craft of writing, the measure of music, but they also included strife, decay, and the shadow of old age. Each was both gift and burden, because in the Sumerian view the world required balance. Without joy, sorrow would have no place. Without death, vitality would have no rhythm. This mix of opposites made the me both a comfort and a danger, objects that demanded careful handling. When we picture them, it helps to think less of abstract rites and more of physical tools. These decrees were thought to be held in the hands of Enki, the god of wisdom. They were stacked in his temple, guarded like supplies of food or water. That is where Inanna entered the story. She sought them not for curiosity, but to extend her city's power by claiming civilization's very foundations. The story says she sat with Enki, cup after cup of beer between them, as he passed her one glowing ordinance after another. Priesthood, truth, crafts, festivals, the world itself shifting as each item crossed from one divine hand to another. And yet behind this exchange there's tension. Why did the Lord of Wisdom give away everything so cheaply? Was it simple drunkenness? Or was there strategy beneath the surface, a quiet plan to spread the architecture of order beyond one place and one temple? The myth leaves this unsolved. What we do see is the aftermath. Inanna loading the me onto her boat, pulling mats tight to hide them, then sailing up the Euphrates as day broke on the river. Divine knowledge had changed owners, and in doing so, so had the future of human society. This theft carried deep meaning. It suggested that civilization itself was not humanity's creation, but divine inheritance. Cities gained or lost their strength depending on which me they held. If a settlement possessed the decree of law, it could enforce contracts. If it lacked music or festival, it remained bare of joy. Even deception and warfare were meant to be acquired. No part of human life was outside the divine stockroom. Everything came through these decrees, everything was part of the same system. We can see how this shaped their view of ritual. The Akitu New Year festival was one example. In Babylon, priests and king walked through ceremonies that replayed the granting of me. Each chant and gesture was like a careful relaying of foundation stones, ensuring society remained aligned with divine order. In this way, the me were not distant relics, but daily standards. Every prayer, every rite, was a rehearsal of the cosmic transfer that made cities possible. What surprises us is that even the darker me were kept with equal concern. Chaos itself was listed. Old age was listed. Falsehood had its me beside truth. This reveals something critical in Mesopotamian thought. Suffering was not an accident outside order. it was woven into order. Just as rivers required both flood and calm, so life required struggle as well as triumph. To pretend otherwise would be to deny the world's balance. The me made sure that even flaws and endings had legitimacy. The physical preservation also mattered. Temple scribes copied long lists of me onto clay tablets. Each wedge mark was a safeguard, a way to ensure these decrees remained in memory. You can imagine a student rehearsing them line by line, aware that forgetting even one might unbalance the recording of the divine order. The labour was repetitive, but with each copy, civilization reminded itself that its structure needed constant attention. Order did not hold by itself, it had to be sustained. Like bricks in a city wall, the me produced both lasting strength and possible failure. When aligned, they built stability. When neglected, they made fragility clear. Imagine an arch. As long as each stone is supported, it holds weight. Remove or misplace one and collapse begins. The me worked in much the same way, both as assurance and as warning. This is why ritual mattered so much. Each festival, each offering, was an act of repair and maintenance, like checking foundations before cracks spread. Economic life tied into this as well. Temples managed herds, estates, workshops, and trade, not only to support priests but to fund ceremonies that kept alignment with the decrees. Records from temple archives count thousands of animals offered across the year. These sacrifices were not random acts of devotion. They were considered payments that kept the channel open between gods and mortals, ensuring the me remained active rather than fading into neglect. We also find the link to law and governance. The earliest known codes of justice begin with claims that the king received authority from the high gods. This made the Anunnaki the final judges of human order. A law was not just social agreement but divine echo. It worked because it was grounded in the decrees established in that first cosmic distribution of the me. By following such codes, a society declared its allegiance to the architecture of order set down beyond human reach. If we step back, we see a pattern. The me were not frozen artifacts. They were active, transferable, sometimes even contested. They made societal life possible, but they also reminded people that stability always depends on continued agreement with divine structure. You could not keep civilization running by cleverness alone. You had to keep it tuned to what the me prescribed. They were both blueprint and contract, both property of the gods and fragile loan to humanity. Inanna's boat sliding upriver beneath morning light carried more than divine items. It carried the very possibility of organized life. Priests, laws, music, writing, all packaged as glowing decrees under reed mats. The story warns us and comforts us at once. Everything we build is only a continuation of those transfers, those fragile exchanges between mortals and the unseen council. And from here, the question grows more pressing. If the me made society possible, how would that society endure when the Anunnaki themselves began to withdraw, leaving humans to guard and preserve a framework passed down from the gods? Picture a dim chamber in Hattusa, the Hittite capital, where a scribe sits hunched over a tablet of wet clay. He copies wedge-shaped marks that he does not fully understand. The words are foreign syllables borrowed from another land, held in the old shapes of cuneiform, and yet he presses them carefully, repeating names that trace back to Sumer, names like the Anunnaki. In these borrowed words, a council of sky beings moves silently across borders. Their authority is lifted from one culture and set down into the framework of another. You can almost hear the scratch of the stylus, a sound carried through distance and time. What we witness here is more than simple borrowing. The people of Anatolia were not just cataloguing foreign gods as curiosities. They were absorbing entire systems, folding Mesopotamian concepts of order, councils, and destinies into their own structures of belief. To them, the Anunnaki were not just one more set of divine names. They were proof of a working cosmic hierarchy, a scheme that had already helped stabilize cities far to the south. When Hurrians and later the Hittites adapted this mythology, they were importing not only deities but also a vision of how the universe was governed. But something shifted in translation. In Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki stood as the children of sky, the royal offspring that formed assemblies. In Hurrian and Hittite myth, they became former gods. Their position echoes through stories of succession, where younger gods rise to rule while older ones are sent below. This alteration does not erase their authority, but places it in a different sphere. These divine elders are no longer arbiters in the heavens. Instead, they function as underworld judges, enforcing order from beneath the soil. So imagine the priests of Anatolia looking southward. They adopt the drama of storm gods rising to power. The young god Teshub takes his throne above, the thunderer who rules the weather. The older generation is not destroyed. They are relegated to the shadowed halls below. There they become witnesses to oaths, guarantors of treaties. This mirrors a political order all too familiar, one dynasty displacing another, yet older lineages retain honour and weight, especially in matters of law. In reshaping the Anunnaki, these cultures mapped divine politics onto human politics, binding their stories together. Now close your eyes and picture a treaty ceremony in Anatolia. A king grips a clay tablet as scribes record every line, terms of land, tribute and alliance. Priests invoke bright storm gods who stand above. But the reciters do not stop there. They call upon the former gods below, the silent Anunnaki, to serve as unseen judges. Oathbreakers will not only face the thunder of the sky, but also the judgment of the deep. In this dual warning, you can hear the echo of Mesopotamian logic, an appeal to counsel and order translated into a new tongue. The mechanics of this borrowing were practical as well as spiritual. Cuneiform carried the names forward, etched in signs that originally belonged to the Sumerians. Hittite scribes adopted the same script for their own language. When they pressed the word Anunnaki, they preserved the old syllables with little change. That act itself reveals prestige. To copy a name in its foreign form is to preserve an aura of ancient weight, a recognition that these beings embody a deeper inheritance of authority. Even when stories changed, the written marks kept them tied to their homeland of rivers and reeds. What makes this process so revealing is its nuance. These cultures did not erase Mesopotamian tradition, they relayered it. The Anunnaki were not static idols that stayed intact through centuries, they were a flexible category. To place them in the underworld did not remove them from power, it assigned them a new role suited to a different pantheon. This is adaptation as reciprocity. New gods rise, yet older. Gods remain to guard contracts, punish deceit, and preserve unseen order. Think of it like an ancient landscape reshaped by floodwaters. Fields wash away, rivers cut new channels, but underneath lies older soil. Crops planted afterwards still draw nutrition from those prior layers. The Hittite myths may have thundered with storms, but beneath them the roots still held Mesopotamian clay. The Anunnaki endured as part of that substrate, silently nourishing the new growth. This also hints at a deeper theme common to the entire region. Divine succession mirrors human succession. In cities and courts, younger leaders often took power from elder rulers, yet the prestige of ancient houses remained. Dynasties rarely vanish. They linger as advisors, judges, or ancestral figures. The Anunnaki embody that same pattern of displacement without disappearance, a divine aristocracy set aside yet still present, whose sanction determines fate even when others rule. Archeology reflects this cultural layering too. Fragments of Mesopotamian stories appear in Hurrian and Hittite libraries, not as foreign imports, but as integrated scriptures. A myth written for one people becomes evidence for another. Within these layers is a living example of myth in motion. It reminds us stories are not static. They migrate, transform, and attach themselves to new soil. As we trace these movements, it becomes clear that the Anunnaki were not simply Mesopotamian gods frozen in one belief system. They operated as a kind of shared vocabulary for the ancient Near East. Across mountains and rivers, their names became shorthand for elder authority, for cosmic judgment, for the weight of oaths. No matter how much their role shifted, their presence conveyed stability. Like a seal pressed on clay, their mark travelled across cultures, still legible long after the context changed. What this tells us is not only about religion, but about the way power was legitimated. Kings in Anatolia learned to swear both to sky and to underworld, to call upon both fresh strength and old weight. This dual invocation bound human treaties with divine oversight, making politics an extension of cosmic order. To invoke the Anunnaki was to tie oneself back to ancient origins, to remind allies and enemies alike that even unseen judges could enforce truth. If we let that image settle, we begin to see the Anunnaki less as distant figures trapped in one myth, and more as a flexible symbol of ancestral authority. Their identity proved durable because it could shift shapes, arbiters in one moment, underworld judges in another, but always aligned with the principle that order requires witnesses older than the current age. This persistence, even after their relocation to the depths, signals a particular kind of endurance. So the question becomes why such figures keep surviving inside new frameworks. Perhaps it is because societies need a sense of deeper continuity, a foundation layer beneath shifting skies. The Anunnaki supplied that, functioning as ancient pillars no matter who sat on the latest throne. Their names on Hittite tablets are proof of that endurance. From here, our path carries us back toward meaning itself. If the Anunnaki could be reshaped across languages, if their authority could be shifted underground yet remain potent, then what did their name actually signify? And why does that name, pressed into clay in Sumer and echoed in Anatolia, appear in so many forms across the ancient world? The tip of a reed stylus scratches across damp clay. A Babylonian scribe pauses, his hand hesitating mid-word. Yesterday, he copied a hymn that called upon 50 great Anunnaki. Today's ritual text insists on 7 who decree fate. He frowns, then presses the wedges anyway, leaving the contradiction in place. For us it might seem sloppy. For him, it didn't matter. Both versions were correct, because both served the ritual context in which they were spoken. That pause of the scribe hints at a deeper puzzle. What, or who, exactly were the Anunnaki? And why did their number change so easily? When we try to picture them, we imagine a pantheon with fixed memberships, something like a lineup carved in stone. But the ancient scribes resisted that kind of rigidity. For them, the Anunnaki formed a category, not a set list. Sometimes they appeared as a small circle of judges. At other times they expanded into a full cosmic assembly of elders. The fact that they could grow or shrink depending on the need tells us something about how Mesopotamian religion worked. It was not about keeping tallies. It was about matching divine structure to circumstance. The meaning of their very name reflects this. Anunnaki can be understood as offspring of An, the Skyfather, or those of princely seed. Built into it is genealogy and legitimacy. Just as a king's claim to rule stood on his ancestry, these beings drew their authority from the higher source in the heavens. Notice too the key, at the end, often linked with the word for earth or land. So their range stretched from sky to ground. They stood as bridges across realms, carrying the weight of cosmic ancestry, but ruling in ways that touched human lives on Earth. The switching of numbers follows the function. In ceremonies dealing with the fixing of fates, 7 were invoked, echoing the structure of judgment and the power of the number itself in Mesopotamian thought. 7 linked to the known wandering lights in the sky and to the rhythm of the week. 7 meant limit and order. But when kingship or cosmic renewal was at stake, the texts swell to 50 names, drawing on a complete assembly. The Anunnaki then were scalable. They might act with the precision of 7 voices or the chorus of 50. Neither was contradiction. It was adaptation. If we picture the scribal process, the flexibility becomes even clearer. A priest in Uruk, preparing for a festival rite, recites and copies verses that refer to 7 Anunnaki. Meanwhile, across the river in Nippur, another priest pens a ritual text in which the Anunnaki appear as a host, so numerous they are almost countless, all in attendance at the cosmic gathering. Both compositions enter sacred archives. Both will be copied and preserved. The multiplicity is not a mistake but an accepted feature of the system. The Anunnaki were not bound by one fixed membership. They embodied assembly itself. Modern readers often stumble here. We expect consistency like a roster of Olympians. That expectation has opened space for modern theories. In some popular circles, the Anunnaki are reimagined as a fixed group of 12 ancient rulers, often tied to the idea of alien visitors or planetary lineages. But when we go back to the clay, to the words preserved by scribes 5,000 years ago, the picture does not support that fixity. Instead, the tablets show variety. They show numbers that change with ceremony, roles that shift with setting, and contexts that allow the category to expand and contract with situational need. This was not a flaw. It matched the deeper logic of Mesopotamian society. Human kings never ruled alone. They relied on councils of elders, advisors, assemblies of merchants and priests. These circles of power expanded when communal decision needed wider voices, and shrank when swift judgment was required. The divine assemblies mirrored these earthly practices. The Anunnaki acted as elder authorities whose collective rulings fixed fates and charted cosmic order. Their very fluidity echoed the procedures of human governance, where participation matched the scale of decision at hand. Think of it like a river system. During dry months, the water gathers in a narrow channel, controlled and small but still flowing. In flood season, the whole plain fills, carrying silt and power across wide ground. Yet it is the same river, obeying variations dictated by season. The Anunnaki work in similar pattern. They condense into 7 judges when precision matters. They expand into 50 elders when cosmic renewal demands a full chorus. The flow is continuous, though its breadth changes with time. The language itself reinforces this pattern. We find spellings, accents, and variants across different cities and centuries. Dialect shaped how the name took form. Liturgy shaped which role they carried. One hymn might invoke them as arbiters, another as judges of the underworld, another as guarantors of treaties. What stays constant is that they represent the principle of council. They enact decision by group rather than by isolated command. This meant their category absorbed variety rather than excluded it. So when you see 7 Anunnaki in one tale, 50 in another, and undefined multitudes elsewhere, you are not seeing confusion. You're seeing flexibility. You're seeing ritual logic at work. The scribes did not think in terms of contradiction. They thought in terms of fit, adapting the heavenly council to the needs of the moment. Our urge for fixed lists narrows the idea. Their world allowed elasticity because their gods represented process, not membership alone. This reframing also helps explain how the Anunnaki crossed boundaries into other cultures. Their adaptability made them easy to adopt and reshape. If 7 worked for one people and 50 for another, the category still held because what mattered was collective decision. Authority lay in the act of assembly and decree, not in the precise tally. That is why their names surface in Hurrian and Hittite texts, sometimes as elder gods in the underworld, sometimes as grand assemblies, always retaining the echo of ancestral weight from the Sky Father. This, then, may be the strongest clue to their true identity. They are less about individuals, more about a principle. The numbers serve ceremony, the name serves genealogy, and the roll serves order. The Anunnaki existed as embodiment of council itself. They were the votes that carve reality, the consensus that sets boundaries, the deliberation that keeps chaos from flooding through. 7 or 50, both are masks worn by the same function. So the Babylonian scribe who paused mid-word was not troubled by inconsistency. He knew both lists carried weight, each for its moment. That clay he pressed told us something profound. Cosmic authority was not a fixed lineup, but an adaptable body. It could appear with few or many voices, yet always speak with the same collective mandate. And because of that adaptability, the pattern of the Anunnaki would not remain confined to Sumer alone. It would travel outward, reshaped across cultures, carrying with it the enduring logic of assembly as a cosmic force. The scene opens with something familiar, pages turning under a dim lamp in 1976. A man sits at a desk and reads through a new book. Its cover bears a bold title, The 12th Planet. Inside, the story is startling. The claim is that the old gods of Mesopotamia were not gods at all, but travellers from a far planet, a world called Nibiru. These beings had ships, tools, and a mission. They came to mine the earth for gold, and in that process they created humans as workers. For many readers, this was a sudden shift in understanding, an ancient language transcribed into science fiction terms. That moment marked a turning point. With one book, the Anunnaki no longer lived only in hymns or temple stories. They stepped into the modern imagination as astronauts and engineers. This narrative spread fast through other books, documentaries, and later television shows. Instead of cosmic judges, they became alien visitors. Instead of shaping destiny in councils, they were said to run mining projects, with humanity their accidental workforce. The story caught hold because it bridged two ideas, ancient history and futuristic contact. It suggested that myths might be misunderstood reports of real encounters, and yet, when you look at the actual clay tablets, the picture is far different. Cuneiform hymns and epics describe assemblies of gods, councils where decisions about floods or kingship were debated. They show the Anunnaki as figures who decree balance, who determine mortal destiny, or who sit as judges in the underworld. They appear again and again in such roles. No ship, no engine, no obvious mention of planets outside the known sky. The difference between these ancient records and the modern retelling is wide. That gap raises a strong question. How did the leap from clay hymns to interstellar mining occur? Imagine instead another scholar in that same period, not in a living room but in a quiet museum room. On the table rests a clay fragment, rough at the edges, 4,000 years old. The researcher traces the wedge-shaped impressions. They mouth the word Anunna. The sound links them across millennia to the scribe who first pressed it. To that scholar, the word signals assembly, kinship, judgment. It never points to mechanics or rockets. The text's meaning lies in the old Mesopotamian view of a world governed by order and balance. The sound of the word connects to human questions about fate, not metal ships. There is a reason the gap exists. Mesopotamian texts are dense, poetic, and often open-ended. They were not written for us, but for ritual, for temple recitation, and for a culture fluent in its own symbolism. In those gaps, modern writers found space to imagine. They filled silence with new kinds of stories, ones tuned to 20th century concerns. Space travel was in news reports, genetic engineering was in laboratories, ecological fear called for resources like gold. Coupling these current anxieties with ancient fragments created a new myth, one of gods as visitors from stars who left when their work was done. This is not unusual in human storytelling. Consider how symbols evolve through eras. To Sumerians, the Anunnaki embodied cosmic councils, ideal forms of order. To Babylonians, centuries later, they shifted into judges of the underworld. In those contexts, their essence adjusted to fit new needs. In today's world, they turned into scientists or alien rulers, because those images resonate now. Each age projects its own frame onto inherited symbols. Just as river sediments form new layers over old beds, interpretations settle, reshape, and filter meaning through time. Seen this way, the Anunnaki become an example of myth's plasticity. They show how a name can travel across borders and centuries, changing costume but staying present. The framing shifts, sometimes sky court, sometimes death's tribunal, sometimes alien crew. But at the centre stands a task, to help humans locate themselves in a wider universe. Whether that universe is governed by stars, fate, or planets beyond vision depends on who is asking. The question persists while the answer morphs, century by century. Picture two children to bring this into focus. One today lies in bed and listens to a glowing screen where images of spacecraft fill the room. The voice claims these ships carried the Anunnaki to Earth. Half a world away, long ago, another child in Uruk drifts to sleep hearing chants in temple courtyards. Priests whisper the Anunnaki's names while invoking their power to decree the New Year's destiny. Both children carry sound and story into dreams. One hears cosmic judges, another hears cosmic travelers. The pattern is the same, placing human life inside something larger. So what do we make of this tension? On the one side, the slow care of cuneiform scholars who emphasize hymn, prayer and assembly. On the other, the fast-moving tales of books and documentaries that call the gods engineers from stars. They may seem opposite, but in function, they overlap. Each offers a way to ask, where do we come from? Who gives us purpose? Why do we build and work and worship? In those questions, origin myths and space theories start to look less like rivals and more like twin attempts to calm the same old curiosity. This tells us something about myth itself. Myths need not be fixed in one shape. They migrate and adapt, carrying kernels of meaning suitable for each age. What matters is not whether the Anunnaki mined or decreed, but what role they played in the imagination of those who spoke of them. In each telling, they framed human labour, judgment, or cosmic connection. Their authority anchored our sense of being inside a larger order. That continuity is more certain than any single interpretation. From this point, we can set aside the modern overlay. The alien engineers and their planet remain vivid stories in popular culture, yet the texts of Sumer hold different images. When we return to those sources, we find councils, ritual duties, and temple rites. We find gods whose work was to sustain balance, not to harvest metals. To see them clearly, we must step back into the rhythm of daily life in Mesopotamian cities, where clay tablets, temple kitchens, and festival chants tied human and divine together. What remains is not engines but echoes of order, humming through the oldest civilizations. And it is to that older context we now turn. The sound of drums travels across the mud brick walls of Uruk at dusk. The beat rolls out over the canals where reed boats slip through dark water. Torches flicker on the high steps of the ziggurat, each flame casting long shadows against walls shaped by centuries of labour. From the rooftops comes the smell of smoke, dough baking, incense lifting through narrow alleys. The city hums with rhythm, each sound and scent woven into the fabric of ritual life. This was not noise for its own sake. It was a way to keep human breath aligned with divine decree. When we picture power in the ancient world, we often imagine armies or treasure. Yet authority here was carried in ritual space. Uruk, Nippur and Eridu formed a kind of sacred triad. Each city stood not only as a centre of people, but as a station in a cosmic network. These were not mere clusters of homes and markets. They were anchors on earth for the assembly of the Anunnaki, binding clay and sky together. Every corner of these cities whispered divine names as though the streets themselves carried memory. Think of Uruk at nightfall. Smoke rises from bread ovens while children chase each other between doorways. From a nearby courtyard, a family kneels before a small lamp offering prayers. These gestures echoed myths of beginnings, retold not in books but in daily tasks. A pot offered, a loaf left before a shrine. Each act was a miniature version of creation itself. As night deepens, incense drifts from the great temple courtyards, and the ziggurat looms above, its brick layers stacked like steps toward heaven. The Anu ziggurat was more than a tall building. Its very shape, tier upon tier, meant to mirror the link between heavens and earth. And yet, daily ritual life was not casual. It was built on the weight of history. Uruk stood as a mighty centre through which order flowed. But legitimacy itself came from Nippur. To rule Mesopotamia, a king might control land or armies. Still, he would travel hundreds of miles to kneel before priests at Enlil's temple, the Iggy. Here, fixing destinies was more than phrase. It was the heart of kingship. Only by being blessed in Nippur could a reign carry cosmic approval. Imagine a royal figure waiting under torchlight while priests chant in ancient Sumerian. Their voices call upon the Anunnaki Council, not to grant battle strength, but to judge worthiness. Overhead the sky remains quiet, but in the small shifts of ritual words, political order turns to cosmic law. Eridu tells another part of the story. It rose from the southern marshes, the oldest city remembered as the place where kingship first descended from heaven. Its temple to Enki towered above reeds and shallow waters. Fishermen in reed boats could watch fires glowing on its terraces, signals of divine presence in the heart of wetlands. Eridu was not only myth, but also a hub of learning. Temple schools copied and preserved tablets. Workshops experimented with techniques. To plant, to build, to write. All were seen as gifts of divine patronage. The city carried memory of beginnings, where earthly governance linked directly to cosmic order. Notice how these centres shared a pattern. They were not separate shrines scattered without logic. Each city performed a piece of a wider choreography. In Uruk, sacred architecture reached skyward. In Nippur, ritual decided legitimacy. In Eridu, the weight of history anchored beginnings. Together they formed a triangle of meaning that tied human cities to divine assembly chambers supposedly echoing above. Kings did not simply take power, they borrowed it, on loan from the Anunnaki whose decrees gave shape to mortal plans. Daily life also bent to this framework. Farmers carried barley to temples, not only to feed priests but to fulfill a contract first struck in myth. Potters brought new vessels, herders led lambs up stone stairs, all reenacting the Atrahasis bargain. Humans serve, gods decree. The Driem records speak of thousands of animals brought to sanctuaries each year. Such flows of grain, oil and livestock made temples into economic powers. To offer food and incense was not just symbolic but practical, sustaining both divine images and earthly administration. The line between religion and economy blurred until they became one and the same. Temple architecture reinforced this fusion. Rising terraces of ziggurats resembled mountains, each level a step from earth to sky. To climb those steps in ritual was to move through spheres of authority. The form itself reminded people that their city sat at the foot of a cosmic hierarchy. Every beam and brick pointed upward, yet the actions at the base determined whether blessings flowed down. The New Year festival put this clearly into action. Each year, in Babylon and beyond, priests reenacted the cycle of divine order. The king endured symbolic trial, stripped of regalia, standing vulnerable before images of gods. Only after ritual humiliation could he be restored, his power renewed by divine decree. This ceremony mirrored myths of descent and ascent, echoing the journeys of gods between underworld and sky, but translated into political theatre. The Anunnaki Council lived here, in chants, in solemn vows, in the delicate balance between ritual submission and renewal. Priests carried layers of roles. Some supervised vast estates linked to temples, others performed music, purification, or administrative tasks. Each responsibility echoed aspects of divine service. When a priest placed bread on an altar, he maintained not only a god's table, but also society's link to cosmic law. The smallest gesture had ripples, binding earth to sky. Legal codes reflected this connection too. The Code of Ur-Nammu declared that kings drew their authority from An and Enlil. Justice itself carried divine warrant. To break a law was not only to cross secular rules, but to step outside cosmic order. Written law, temple ledgers, ritual inventories, all these documents anchored society in decrees that priests claimed originated in divine assembly. So when we imagine these cities, we shouldn't only see mud brick walls and reed boats. We should picture a kind of three-point system stabilizing a wider cosmos. Uruk provided the visual and sensory spectacle. Nippur held the keys to political legitimacy. Eridu rooted the very memory of beginnings. Together they made the presence of the Anunnaki not abstract but woven into kitchens, marketplaces, laws and sacrifices. To walk through one of these cities at night was to move through a palace of invisible voices, each lamp burning in a doorway, each loaf left before a shrine, each oath sworn in a courtyard. These were reminders of unseen counselors sitting far above or deep below. These beings, once called offspring of the sky, lingered not only in myths, but in every act of daily life. From these torchlit rituals rises another question, one both intimate and unsettling. If the Anunnaki's assembly fixed destinies through ceremony, then where did that leave the path of each person walking narrow city streets? What did it mean for human fate to be balanced in council chambers beyond human reach? The silence of that question still drifts with the smoke from temple fires into the night air. In the quiet before sunrise, a priest walks the dim halls of Nippur's temple. His hand drags across a clay tablet, finger following wedge marks carved by a reed stylus days before. He whispers the numbers to himself: 7 who decree, 50 who deliberate, countless who watch. These are not idle counts. They are measures of the Anunnaki's reach, as careful and necessary as lists of grain tallied in a storeroom. This focus on numbers and lists was more than habit. Mesopotamia thrived on record keeping. They wrote king lists reaching back to when they believed rulers first received power from heaven. They charted the stars with such care that a clear sky could read like an almanac, every constellation tied to the rhythm of fate. They pressed into thousands of tablets omen series where each small event carried a message, if only one knew how to interpret it. For them, catalogues were not dry indexes. They were the scaffolding of existence. And yet, the deeper truth is almost startling. Listing wasn't simply about administration. It was theology in action. To the scribes and priests, nothing could occur without prior decree, and decrees had to be preserved. To speak, to write, to ritualize, these were ways of pinning divine order in place. If the council of sky beings fixed the shape of the coming year, then every earthly record had to match that invisible register. At Babylon's New Year festival, this principle showed itself most clearly. Before dawn, in temple courtyards, priests gathered in anticipation. they called upon the Anunnaki assembly to secure the paths of the new year. The voices rose not in casual prayer, but in a precise sequence of chants and actions. Each word and movement carried the idea of official proclamation, as if mortals mirrored the sessions of a grand cosmic court. The year was not left to chance. It was formally calibrated through collective invocation. Think of it as bureaucracy on a divine scale. Just as city halls filed contracts, warehouses counted goods, and scribes copied ledgers, the gods too kept inventories of order. The Anunnaki were not improvisers. They did not roll dice to decide human fortune. Their decisions unfolded like court rulings, reviewed, deliberated, recorded, then enforced. The rituals were not reenactments built from superstition. They were the human half of a correspondence with greater administrators who, in myth, sat far above. Divination practices expose this logic well. Picture a priest examining the glossy surface of a sheep liver by lamplight, glancing at ridges, shapes, and strange marks. Each feature had already been catalogued in an omen series, a kind of directory pairing liver shapes with likely fates. To read signs was less about predicting than it was about retrieving decisions already made in the divine assembly's chambers. Cracks in heated clay, paths of birds, signs in smoke. Every one of them was turned into bureaucratic code, a kind of official memo passed from heaven to earth. Even treaties carried this weight. When rulers met to seal political contracts, they placed their words under the guardianship of the Anunnaki. It wasn't enough to rely on human honesty or enforcement. Tablets recorded these agreements while also invoking the sky beings as the ultimate guarantors. Should one king betray the deal, punishment would arrive not from human courts, but from an assembly that existed beyond worldly reach. These texts show how divine names were by design written into earthly law, bridging cosmic and civic judgment. From this perspective, Mesopotamian culture appears almost as a great ledger of existence. Grain stores, star paths, royal lineages, ritual obligations, each aligned neatly into lists. The very act of enumeration brought the world closer to stability. It reflected a belief that order was not natural but required constant upkeep. Like canals that silted if not dredged, cosmic order too could degrade without repeated inscription and review. The gods were thought to maintain the universe exactly as scribes managed inventories, carefully, formally, step by step, line by line. The priest-dawn ritual then was more than piety. It was participation in this perceived paperwork of the cosmos. Each whisper of 7, 50, countless wasn't superstition, it was synchronization. His small voice folded into the imagined echoes of celestial clerks, ticking off the roster of fate. The Anunnaki were not personal companions or heroes. In this role, they were auditors of time, fixers of destiny, holders of ledgers too immense for human eyes. Consider the larger implication. For Mesopotamians, the Anunnaki's silence was not absence, it was procedure. Their authority appeared in the quiet certainty that things were being recorded, that some higher register had already listed tomorrow's course. In that certainty lay both ease and unease. Ease, because the world was not random. Unease, because choice felt shaped by rulings already entered in cosmic archives. By layering heavenly decrees over civic life, they built a mirror between spheres. Citizens experienced laws that came from their city assemblies, while priests described parallel judgments by divine councils. Kingship itself was argued to descend from these cosmic deliberations, further tying legal order to sacred review. Every seal, chant, tally, or star chart worked to hold humanity within this system of overseen measure. This culture gave us more than myths. It handed down the idea that order arises through writing, counting, and documenting. The fact that some of the oldest surviving texts are lists rather than stories tells us how central this mindset was. These people lived as if the act of enumeration itself kept the cosmos upright. We may see their vision as stark, yet it contained comfort. Their gods did not sway as stormy moods or chance strikes. Their gods functioned as overseers who weighed, counted, and issued. What mattered was alignment with that system, ensuring every human transaction, from harvest bins to political oaths, reflected the decrees of the unseen council. So numbers whispered in a temple chamber meant more than arithmetic. They were reminders that reality itself was tracked and tallied as carefully as barley stored in jars. In this way, the Anunnaki became administrators hidden in every tally mark, silent but unavoidable. Not dramatic, not personal, but permanent through their paperwork of destiny. And it is here the story turns again. For if their role was to set measures and keep ledgers, what happens when their presence begins to fade? Every system that manages and records eventually has to pass its files onward. In Mesopotamian thought, the same logic applies. The Anunnaki, those recorders of cosmic balance, would one day fall quiet, leaving humanity not abandoned but entrusted, inheritors of the very systems once maintained by the Sky's own council. Sand shifts in the deep dark. You hear it before you see it, a low hush moving across the stone floor of an ancient gate. The gate of Ganzir stands open, its bronze hinges worn smooth. Countless souls have pushed against them, pressing forward into silence. They enter to face a council who waits in patience that does not bend with time. Here the Anunnaki sit, not as fearsome conquerors, but as steady arbiters. Their court is not loud. It is slow, patient, inevitable. The underworld of Mesopotamia was called the land of no return. Bread there is dust, water is clay. Torches burn low, yet the darkness is never fully cleared. Shadows move through those halls with no hurry, and there at the threshold the Anunnaki take their seats like magistrates who never need to leave. They are not imagined as chaotic or fickle, but as fixed points in the great structure. Nothing enters without being watched. No soul passes without a place being assigned. For the living this sounded terrifying, but there was comfort too. They knew death would not fall at random. Disease, accident, age, none of these came without decree. Even the end was placed in order by silent judges. The Anunnaki did not shout rulings, their gaze was enough. That stern presence meant that every life, however short, was drawn into the structure of the universe. An end, yes, but not a collapse. Seasons gave them a language for this verdict. Dumuzi and Inanna embodied it. When Inanna returned from the depths without penalty, balance tilted. The law of exchange had been broken, so the Anunnaki called for a substitute. Dumuzi, the shepherd, became that stand-in. He was dragged to the shadow halls where he remained through half the year. His sister Inanna softened the decree with her own readiness. She shared the burden, allowing him to rise again when her turn arrived. This bargain explained the cycles that fed ancient life. When fields browned and flocks weakened, they said Dumuzi had gone down. When shoots broke soil again, he was free once more. The Anunnaki did not choose lightly. They chose to mirror what the earth revealed. That loss and growth belonged together. No one could separate them. No god, no king, no farmer. Balance flowed only when both descent and return were honoured. On the surface world, this understanding shaped daily acts. Shepherds sang laments for Dumuzi in early summer. Their words were not cries against cruelty, but songs of endurance, knowing renewal would return. Farmers turned earth in autumn with the same trust. They buried seed with the awareness it too would descend. The Anunnaki's decrees were not read only in myths. They were visible in the rhythm of plants, flocks, rivers, and stars. Imagine a dawn over Mesopotamia. The ziggurat catches first light. Priests rise, voices steady from long habit. They chant as they have for lifetimes, securing earthly rhythms to the timeless decrees above and below. Farmers already gather tools for the day, water jars across shoulders. Children linger at the canal's edge, laughing as they throw dust in arcs. All of them move within an order they do not need to name. That order is the Anunnakis. In this model of the world, death was not chaos. It was confirmation of structure. You might lose someone close, but even that sorrow was absorbed into the larger balance. The council's silence was not neglect. It was steadiness. No grief, however sharp, would undo the rule that the universe demanded proportion. Rise and fall, fullness and emptiness, breath and stillness. The council guaranteed that one side could not exist without the other. The withdrawal of the Anunnaki from direct contact did not silence this system. It continued in subtler form. Their names may have faded from city streets, but their decrees lived on as the rhythm of fields and skies. Every lifespan, long or brief, became a line in their grand measure. Every cycle of planting and reaping replayed Dumuzi's trial. The Anunnaki no longer appeared often in myths as flesh figures or thunderous voices, yet their presence remained as boundary keepers, woven into natural law. Think of the world as their quiet assembly hall now. Every sunrise is a decree written in light. Each harvest is their vote of balance maintained. A peaceful death is not silence, but a verdict. Order has not failed. This is the lasting shape they gave. They anchored life to rule even after their own retreat. Picture once more the gates of Ganzia. They remain open. Souls still cross the bronze, but there is no spectacle of punishment, only placement. The great chairs are filled with those who measure rather than rage. Their silence is steady guidance rather than threat. Around them stretch halls where shadows move without protest. There is no resistance because the structure is total. It contains all. On the surface, reed boats glide along canals lit by the faint glow of torches. Soon night recedes. Flames are doused in temple courtyards, replaced by the pale flood of dawn. Workers stir. The city hums its slow beginning. Grain baskets on the move, goats tugging at ropes, children trailing mothers to the well. In this ordinary rhythm the Anunnaki still speak, though not in words. Their voice is pattern, their counsel is continuity. Their rule is the moderation of cycles we do not control but depend upon. And as cities rise with that first light, the Anunnaki sink back to the background. Their direct watch has ended, but their structure endures, fused into time itself. We no longer see them as figures at the gate, but we live inside their decrees without choice. Every day that follows pattern, and every night that gathers silence belongs to their assembly still.